Hello everyone, this is Ashley Tucker. Thank you for joining me today. Today I'm going to be using some alcohol inks to create a really icy looking winter background. And I should mention that whenever you're working with alcohol inks, you want to have some good ventilation in the room because they are pretty strong. So before I started using the alcohol inks, I got out my craft mat because you definitely want to protect your work surface because these inks are pretty messy. Normally when I work with alcohol inks, I like to use disposable gloves in order to keep my hands clean, but I actually just ran out of my gloves, so I had to get my hands a little messy for this. The paper that I'm using for the alcohol inks is Yupo paper. So I added a lot of each of the inks that I used, and I started at the corners and worked my way in towards the center. The colors that I used are indigo, sailboat blue, stream, mermaid, and pool. Now usually when I work with alcohol inks, I like to add the blending solution to get the inks really moving around. But for this particular project, I really didn't want to dilute the inks at all. I wanted them to be really, really rich and deep in color, so I didn't add any of that alcohol blending solution. So to get the inks moving around and blending, all I did was take a straw and blow some air on it. And you can see my head poking in every now and then to do that. Once I was happy with this, I let it dry completely before moving on. And in order to clean my craft mat, I actually use isopropyl alcohol, and that gets up any of the alcohol ink really well. Next, I took out the Christmas cheer stamp set from Simon Says Stamp. This is actually the stamp set that comes in the December kit. I'm going to be using this stamp set for all of the stamping on this card. I took all of the snowflake stamps from the set and I arranged them in my MISTI tool to stamp onto this alcohol ink panel. And you'll see that I kind of wrestled with that smallest snowflake stamp. It really wanted to stick to the alcohol ink panel. And that's just because alcohol ink tends to stay sticky for quite a while. So I'm going to stamp these snowflakes with the alcohol lift ink. This ink does exactly what you'd think it would based on the name. It actually lifts that alcohol ink right up off the paper and onto the stamps, and then you can actually stamp with that ink that's on the stamps onto another piece of paper. When you lift up your stamps when you're using alcohol lift ink, you might be a little worried because it doesn't look like anything happened, but that's okay, that's normal. Once you finish stamping, you want to take your panel and you want to go over it really well with a dry cloth. This is what lifts up that ink and it makes the stamping really pop. I absolutely love the effect that this creates on this particular panel. I think that it looks gorgeous. I feel like with these colors and the way the alcohol lift ink doesn't remove all of the color completely, it makes this panel look really icy and cold and beautiful. So I just kept stamping those snowflakes until this panel was completely filled up. Next I stamped the sign pole from the same stamp set onto some Bristol smooth paper. Now I actually meant to stamp on Neenah Solar white paper because it's better for coloring with Copics, but I accidentally grabbed the wrong paper, but that's okay because I made it work. So I stamped that with Gina K amalgam ink, and then I lined up some of the sentiments on each of the three signs and I stamped those too. So when you read all three of the signs, it says, "A very Merry Christmas to you and yours." I colored in this sign with some Copic markers, and if you want to know what colors I used, I do have the marker caps on the side of the screen there so that you can see what colors I used. I tried to color the sign to look very similar to the background. I used a lot of the same colors that are in the background, and that's just because I wanted this whole card to have a really icy, frozen feel. That being said, I didn't want the sign to get lost in the background, so whereas the background has mostly dark colors, I used mostly lighter colors on the sign. For the actual pole, I used two colors for each of the stripes, one lighter color and one darker color. First, I would color in the whole stripe with the lightest color, and then I would take my darker color and add some shading to the sides, leaving a highlight right down the middle. And then to finish up the stripe, I would go back to the lighter color and just kind of blend the whole thing together. Once I finished coloring in all of the stripes like that, it looks like there's a really nice highlight going all the way down the center of the pole. Now, because I accidentally used Bristol smooth paper, when I color in each of the signs, the words kind of smudged a little bit. Bristol smooth paper has a really smooth surface, and inks tend to take a little bit longer to dry on it, so that's why I had the smudging, but it wasn't too bad and it didn't bother me a lot. I actually had those stamps still in place in my MISTI, so once all the coloring was done, I re-stamped the words and it made them look a lot more crisp. I used my scanning cut to cut out that sign, and then I took another piece of Bristol smooth paper and I just cut a curve out of it to make a little hill. Next, I'm going to create a vellum overlay for my card. So my alcohol ink panel is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, so I needed my vellum to be 5 1/2 on one side, and the other side needed to be longer than 4 1/4. I scored my vellum at 4 3/8, and I was really careful and gentle when I did that because vellum is very delicate and you don't want to rip it. The reason that I scored at 4 3/8 instead of 4 1/4 is just to be sure that it will cover my whole panel when I fold it around the other side. I knew that I could trim the edge if it was too long, but if it's too short, then I can't really fix that. I used a circle die from the Hero Arts Infinity Circle die set, and I cut a window out of the top of the front of the vellum. Next, I took the same snowflakes that I stamped onto my alcohol ink panel, and I started to stamp them onto the front of that vellum, and I stamped those with Simon Says Stamp embossing ink. It's important to mention that before I started stamping, I went over the vellum really well with my powder tool so that I wouldn't have any issues when I started embossing. The embossing powder that I'm using for the snowflakes is the Rainbow Sparkle embossing powder from Brutus Monroe. If you've been watching my channel recently, you'll know that I've been really liking this embossing powder lately. I love anything that sparkles, so this powder was made for me. So this embossing is actually pretty subtle on the vellum because the Rainbow Sparkle embossing powder is actually a clear embossing powder with some colorful glitter in it. But I really love that subtle look that it creates. So here you'll see the small flap that was created when I scored my vellum. I used my ATG gun to add some adhesive onto that flap, and then I carefully lined up my alcohol ink panel with that vellum panel, and then I folded that edge over to adhere the vellum onto that panel. Next, I took that little hill that I created earlier, and I glued that down onto the alcohol ink panel with my ATG gun. I used some Gina K Connect glue to add some adhesive to the back of the sign pole. I then used my tweezers to help me place this sign so that it's right in the middle of that alcohol ink panel sticking out of the snow. I used my ATG gun to add some adhesive to the back of the alcohol ink panel, and then I adhered that onto an A2 size white card base. I took out my white gel pen and I added some very simple highlights to the sign. I think that adding these highlights is really easy and it can take your colored in images to a whole nother level. I really wanted the pole to look like it was sticking out of the snow, so in order to do that, I added some shadows. I used my N0 and my N2 markers in order to do this. I used some Distress Oxide inks to shade my snow. I used the colors Tumbled Glass and Salty Ocean, and I blended them along the bottom edge of the snow. You could just leave the snow solid white, but this is actually pretty quick to do, and I think it makes the snow look a lot more realistic. Now, of course, I had to add some more sparkle to this card, so I took my Wink of Stella glitter brush and I went over the top edge of the snow so that it looks nice and sparkly, and then I added some of that sparkle to the pole as well. I didn't completely cover the entire sign pole with glitter. I just kind of added it randomly so that it looks like some of the areas are covered in some ice. The last thing that I did to finish up this card is I took some silver and white twine and I wrapped it around the binding of the card, and then I tied it in a bow. Once I got that bow nice and perfect, this card was all done. So here's a closer look at the finished card. So the first thing you have is that vellum overlay with all of those really sparkly snowflakes. And then you open that up and see that gorgeous alcohol ink background. Thank you for watching today. I hope you really enjoyed this card design using the stamp set from Simon Says Stamps December card kit. All of the supplies that I used in today's video can be found in the description down below. If you enjoyed watching this video and you have not subscribed to my channel yet, I would encourage you to hit that subscribe button so that you can see all of my future videos. This coming weekend is actually my wedding, so I won't be having my normally scheduled card on Monday. Instead, my next card will be on Wednesday. Again, thank you for watching. I really appreciate all of you, and I hope you have a great weekend.